Okay, but I think we are on time, so let's make a start. So let's give Harris a welcome. He's going to talk about land issues in African cities, and we had a lot of questions around this. So Harris, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So my name is Harris Selod. I work for the World Bank. So I just want to start by congratulating and thanking the partners, ERSA and the International Growth Center. I think they did a fantastic job. It's really a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I missed the first sessions this morning, so I don't know what questions on land were asked. So you may want to ask them again. I don't know if I have the answers. So this is going to be some presentation about land issues in African cities. I should have said sub-Saharan African cities. So here's the focus. The idea is really to talk about land markets, and especially in terms of the big elephant in the room that I think is informal land use in Africa. And I just want to, share some of the thoughts that I have on land. I've been working on land for, 1 or 2 decades. And then I want to show you a little bit of the research that I did on land. I know some of you are master's students, some of you may be looking into starting some PhDs, so I think the research part may be of interest to some of you. So basically the outline is first to talk about some land concepts. I think the words are quite important. When we talk about land, it's a little bit, fuzzy, so I want to clarify some of the notions first. And then I'll talk about what I perceive as important land issues in sub-Saharan African cities. And then I'll show you a little bit of the research and a short conclusion. So let's start with the key land concepts. So what do we mean when we talk about land? And I really wanted to clarify this for you, but also for myself, because I realize it's not that clear actually. First way to look at land, there are different ways, to look at land. You can think about the portion of space or some specific location within the city. For instance, it can be, the city center versus the suburbs, or a specific, location. The idea is where do, economic activities locate. So we're interested in the use of this portion of space. So that's what you would call, land use. Another way to talk about land is to consider it as some type of commodity. Of course, it's an immobile commodity, so households and firms consume land. So here we talk about, land consumption. For instance, you can have the land that you consume for, housing purposes, your garden. It comes into your utility function. Land can be seen also as a factor of production. So this is really an input for production. For instance, you can think about, a developer who's going to produce some housing and is going to take some, capital and some land and transform it into housing. So in that sense, land can be also an input factor into some production function if you want. And then most importantly, there's some economic rent associated with land, right? Like land is we said an immobile factor, it's in a specific location, and you have someone that has a property right to that place. And people who use the land, they pay a rent to the owner of the land. And that rent reflects, accessibility, the location characteristics, and how all of this is valued by the market. That is by the competition between the different users in order to use the land. So there's the idea of a rent is very important. So land prices, they capitalize those characteristics. They capitalize accessibility and the location characteristics. So this is about first what we call land. Now there's another concept I think is important, is what is a land market? So even the definition of a market actually is kind of, a bit fuzzy. So what do we mean by land market? I think the closest thing that I think that satisfies me to talk about the mechanisms whereby buyers and sellers of land interact with one another. So first thing about market is there some type of structure. You can talk about, market structure. It can be, competitive or not competitive, for instance. Most importantly, land markets involve property rights. So what is traded is actually the right to use or to own the land. So it's really important to think about land in terms of property rights. I think most of my research, thinks about property rights, actually. One other thing to be aware of is that land market can be incomplete. Like not all land actually can be traded. It's not because there's a place that it can be traded that it has a price. It's not always the case. Some regulations may actually forbid the trade or the use of some plots of land. Of course, if those regulations are not enforced and people still trade, then you will have some informal transaction, and we can talk about an informal land market. But also there are systems, and I know many of you are from Africa. I don't know who is from West Africa here? Okay, good. What country are you from? Ghana? Okay, so you're most familiar with customary institutions, I imagine, and actually the rest of Africa as well, but I've been studying mostly West Africa. So basically, customary institutions is some type of institution that existed from time immemorial, if you want, that governs access to land. And often in customary institutions, the land is not for sale, right? You cannot trade the land for monetary exchange. It's just being allocated outside of markets. And this happened actually at the peri-urban, in the peri-urban areas of many of the African cities. So there are places that are not governed by the market. Maybe they will become governed by the market. Maybe there's a clash, when the city expands, it's going to clash into the customary system, and I'm going to talk about those things. So markets can be incomplete in that sense. Maybe another remark here is that the land market can also refer to the specific location, right, where the land can be traded. For instance, you can view a city as one big land market, where you have people that compete with one another to occupy land within the city. You can talk about land market segments also. When you take, let's say, a subcategory for a particular type of land, for instance, there can be a land market segment for commercial land, for residential land, whatever category you want to, impose on land, you can talk maybe about a land market segment. Now, another concept I think that is important is the idea of efficiency. I don't know who is studying economics here in this room. Okay. So some of you have notions about, what economists mean by efficiency. I'll try to clarify this a little bit. So one can talk about a land market being efficient when it results in a use of the land that is efficient. It's some type of concept of optimality, if you want. So the land allocation here refers to who uses what portion of the urban space, what land plots for, what purpose. And the land allocation can be efficient if the land is used in its most productive way, right? You can have uses that are not most productive, but if the allocation results in a use that is in the most productive way, we'll call it efficient. I'll give you an example, right? Well, first remark, if you have markets that function well, trade is supposed, in theory, to lead to some efficient land use. So here's an example. You have Mr. A and Mr. B who live in a city. So Mr. A, actually, he owns a plot at the city center. Mr. A is a farmer. So Mr. A is doing agriculture at the city center. And then you have Mr. B who owns a plot at the periphery, the rural hinterland if you want. But he's a merchant, so he has a shop. But at the periphery, so Mr. A is doing agriculture in a place that is not really prime land for agriculture, so it's low productivity. And Mr. B has a shop, far away from all the customers. So it doesn't sound like very efficient. But if Mr. A and Mr. B agree to trade their plots, so they exchange the plots, then you will have something that is more productive. You will have the shop at the city center, where all the consumers, can travel and commute to the city center and shop. There's a much bigger market for Mr. B. And then Mr. A can do agriculture in the periphery, with productive agricultural land and can produce more agriculture. So this is a more efficient use of the land. So thanks to trade, there was the possibility of a monetary exchange between A and B, and both of them are better off, and it has improved the aggregate wealth, aggregate production in the economy, if you want. So this is the idea of efficient land use. By the way, I forgot to say, feel free to interrupt me anytime if you have a question. Another idea is that competitive markets are supposed to lead to an efficient outcome, right? So for those who have studied microeconomics, we talk about competitive markets when you have large numbers of buyers and sellers, when they have information about the prices, that the price reflects the actual, value of the land. There are no transaction costs. There may be other conditions depending on how people look at those things, but this is the idea of a competitive market that leads to an efficient outcome. Of course, then you have the real world, which is inefficient markets. So the real world, what do we know about it? Is that land markets may actually fail to produce an efficient land use. And in this case, economists like to talk about market failure. Like the market is failing to produce the most productive outcome. So there can be several reasons for that. You can have like oligopolistic behavior, which means that just a few people own the assets. So they have some type of market power on whom they're going to sell the land to. They're going to ask for very high prices, etc. So it kind of distorts a little bit the system. There can be discrepancies in bargaining power between buyers and sellers. That is also going to distort the prices. There can be information asymmetry. Like the buyer knows the characteristics of the plots. Sorry, the seller knows the characteristics of the plots, but the buyer does not know about it. So that's an information asymmetry. So it also affects the price. It may be that some plots are not going to be traded because the buyer does not trust that the seller is offering a plot with good characteristics. So it may actually restrict the amount of trade in the system. So all this actually leads to inefficient land users. You also have the issue of externalities. So in economics, an externality is, let's say, some action, some behavior that affects other people, but that are not priced, right? For instance, if a factory decides to locate in a particular place, which is next to a residential area, it's going to affect the people, but it's not priced. When they paid the price for the land, they just negotiated with the owner of the land, and no one took into account the fact that it's going to be suboptimal because it's going to negatively affect the neighbors. So this leads also to inefficient land use. So in reality, you have all those things and maybe others that leads to the fact that markets very seldom lead to an efficient land use. Maybe it goes towards a more efficient land use, but does not lead to a completely efficient land use. So let's not believe that markets is a silver bullet. So now this is the tough part, but the important part is the property rights issues. I don't know who has been studying property rights. Okay, property rights in land. Okay, that is good. So land tenure. One concept is called land tenure. So let's talk about what is land tenure. Land tenure is about the rights that individuals and communities have with respect to land. So usually people talk about a bundle of rights. That is the right to occupy, the right to use, the right to develop, to inherit, and transfer the land, right? Land tenure is a social relationship. You have a right because other people surrounding you recognize your right, right? Your neighbors recognize that this is your house, it's not their house. You own it, you're the owner. So this social relationship may actually be recognized formally or not. When it is recognized formally, you have a formal land right. Let's say you have a title to your land. When it's recognized informally, you just have an informal land right. That is a right that is outside the legal system. You may not have the documentation to prove it, but you still have some legitimacy over the plot. Now, this is really interesting. If you look especially at African cities, there are various tenure situations. It can be very complex, actually. So I like this concept of a continuum of property rights. This is a concept that UN Habitat has been putting forward for, 15 years now. It's the idea that you have something from no rights, you have a continuum from no rights at all to a fully fledged property right, let's take a freehold registered title, and many, many things in between. And I think it's really important to understand those things in between. So let's say people who have no rights, for instance, they are squatters. They occupy land that someone else owns. So they're not on their own plot. They're not paying a rent. You have a lot of this in informal settlements in South Africa, for instance. The land that they occupy can be public, it can be private. You have people who actually are informally using the land because the way the neighborhood was developed, the way the neighborhood was subdivided, for instance, was not authorized by the authorities. So it's illegal in that sense, but they kind of own the land, but they don't own it legally. So they cannot register, let's say, that property title because the whole thing started informally with the development that was informal. It's unauthorized land development. Then you have situations that are formal, but they're not really formal. It's kind of complex. In many African cities, you have use rights. Sometimes there are temporary use rights, permits to occupy. They have different names in different countries and different cities. They're supposed to be permanent. before you access to a fully fledged property right, but in fact, they're supposed to be temporary before you access the permanent property rights, but in fact, they keep on forever. And I'm saying semi-formal because sometimes the authority that granted the right was not authorized to grant it. For instance, there's been a lot of movement between, centralized versus decentralized governance of the land. At some point, let's say it's the central state that can allocate those permits to occupy. At some times it's the city, and then they go back and forth in the legislation, and you end up with both authorities giving the same type of rights, when in fact only one is authorized in the legislation. So it's kind of semi-formal. You have a document, but it's not really formal. I remember there was an example of this in Kenya, where the airport land was sold by the airport in order to build some housing. But airport land was public land, and only the central state was authorized to sell the land, so the airport was not supposed to sell the land, and they built the housing, and people bought it, and they got property rights. But then the central government said, no, you cannot build there, it's not legal, etc. And I think they were like relocated, and the whole thing went away. So this is what I call semi-formal. And then tenure situations that are formal. You also have various types. You can have the use rights that I talked about, and you have the ownership rights. So I think most of you are familiar with the ownership rights. Let's call it a title, a freehold. It has different names, or it can be like a long-term leasehold. So this is the various situations that you encounter that are located on the continuum. So here's another concept that I think is important is the idea of tenure security. So what is tenure security? You can define it as the likelihood of not being evicted from your plot, right? You have security when you know you can occupy and use the plot without being evicted. There are different levels of tenure security, whether the likelihood is 1 or below 1. The objective measure is really to come up with kind of objective probability, but it's really difficult to assess. So in many of the, let's say, the surveys, people ask for the perception of security. Users of the land are being asked, do you feel secure? What do you think that you may lose your land within 1 year, within 5 years, those type of things. So it's more a perception thing, like a subjective thing that is often measured. There are several surveys that do that. The famous one is the Prindex survey. That is a global survey that is organized by Gallup, where they ask all those questions in urban and rural areas. So it's supposedly representative of the urban and rural areas at the country level. So the idea here is that the formal rights are secure, and the informal rights, of course, are not secure. So formal rights are more valuable than informal rights because they are more secure. So this is what economists, if you look at the difference in price between a formal right and an informal right, people will attribute this difference to the tenure security premium. Of course, the difference in prices may capture other things. Let's say, for instance, the tradability of the right. If it's easier to trade a formal property right than to trade an informal property right, then some of the price difference will also capitalize on that, improved tradability. One can think of other things that explain the difference in prices, but mostly economists are focused on the tenure security premium. So let's say a formal price can be 30% more expensive than the informal price of a formal land can be, let's say, 20% more expensive than the price of an informal plot, for instance. Okay, so there are factors that influence tenure security. You can think about the primary tenure status of the land, whether you're on public land or you're on a private land, for instance. I was talking about squatters. Squatters on private land, maybe they will be evicted much more quickly because the private party is going to go to the tribunal and say you need to evict those guys, whether there may be some tolerance on the public land or there's no tolerance on the public land. It also depends on the policies and how governments behave. Customary land. Customary land is also quite insecure, actually, because often customary rights are recognized in the law, but the documentation is missing. Like the countries, they said, okay, we recognize customary land, but they've never, in some cases they have, but in many cases they have not issued public documents, a publicly issued document that says this is customary land, this is your land. So I was mentioning the political and legal context, and of course the value of the land affects the likelihood of you being evicted if you don't have a formal property right, Because if your land is expensive, some people would want to grab the land. So there will be, predatory behavior. Now, another concept that I think is important is the idea of formalization. So we have this continuum of property rights from completely informal to completely formal. And when you transform something that is informal into formal, we call it formalization. It can be a titling program, often in upgrading interventions. Authorities will kind of improve the neighborhood, but part of the program will consist in providing property titles to people. So it will be a formalization. Okay, now, this is just a little table that I prepared with a co-author several years ago that shows the continuum of land rights, right? When you move horizontally from squatters to the freeholders with everything in between. And then this tells you the level of rights that you have on the different types of tenure situation. So you go from left to right with an increasing level of formality, and from top to bottom with an increasing level of tenure security. And as I was telling you, the freehold is the most secure type of property right, and squatting is the less secure type of property rights. So I'm not going into those details, just to show you the complexity of this. So now that we've gone through some of the key concepts in land, I want to mention just some issues about informal land in African cities. So here I'm just going to list some of the problems that we encounter in African cities. So let's start first with the idea that informality is not good because it reduces investments in land, both public and private. So there are several ideas here, of course. If you are an investor and you're insecure on your plot, you're not going to invest too much on that plot because you know you may lose it, right? So it deters you from investing. So that is really not good. So even if you're just a residential owner, you're not going to invest too much in your house because someone may actually evict you. So this is why also one of the reasons why you have all those, shanty structures in informal settlements, if they are insecure in tenure. People who are afraid that overnight the authorities may come and clear the land, for instance. Of course, there's also the issue of what people can afford, etc. But this prevents investment in housing. It prevents investment in economic activities also, with the same reasoning. Another important point that economists love to talk about is the idea that informality prevents lands from being mortgaged. So if you want to mortgage your land, you want to have access to credit, you go to a financial institution and you say, I pledge my land, give me some money. If I don't repay you, you can take the land, sell it off, and then get your money back. But if your land is informal, you cannot really do it. But let's not think that just because we have formal land, people will do that. You need to have financial institutions in place. You need to have, valuation institution in place. Like you need to have a profession that can value the actual value of the plot so that the financial institution is going to land on that plot, with a mortgage on that plot, etc. So another idea is that for investments, you need to assemble some land. You need to pool some land. For instance, if you build a road, you need to pool a lot of contiguous plots in order to build a road. So if it's all informal, you need to find a way of purchasing the plot or evicting people from the plot. This is costly, takes time, so it reduces the investments. So for firms, their access to land is reduced. They will not invest as much as they would have because land pooling is costly to them. It's costly, as I was saying, to build infrastructure networks. Now, informality also is not good in the sense that it's often associated with harmful socioeconomic, health, and environmental impacts. I was saying that when people are insecure on their plot, they're not going to invest in their housing. So housing is not going to be of good quality. So the conditions that you find in slums usually is not good for human capital accumulation. It's going to deteriorate health as well. There's also this idea that people are not going to work as much as they would have if they had secure tenure. If you're insecure, you may want to leave a member of your household on the plot every day and every night in order to guard the plot. So no one is going to, take your land. So that person is not going to travel outside the household in order to work. I mean, there's a famous paper by Erika Field in Peru where she said that basically this idea of the guarding labor on an insecure plot amounts to 1 person per household. So that's really a lot. So it has labor market effects that are not negligible. There's also the idea that informal housing leads to pollution. For instance, if you live, in an informally developed neighborhood, there's no sanitation, then there's the idea of the pollution of the groundwater, also hydric pollution. So it's not good in that sense also. So also, and this is super important, land informality is a big source of conflict. So one very important issue is the idea of multiple sales. Have you encountered multiple sales in Ghana? It's a very common phenomenon, right? So multiple sales, people want to purchase a plot, and there are several people that pretend that they own the land. Maybe they have different claims. Maybe it's not clear who really owns it. So you buy a plot of land, and someone else buys the same plot of land from another seller. So it's kind of a really completely difficult situation to solve. It's very, very common. It does not only happen with informal plots, it also happens with the formal plots. As I was talking about the semi-formal situations, there are those issues also that come up. There's the idea also that some people are more powerful in society and they can exert their political and financial power in order to evict people. I remember during some field work in Mali, there was in the newspaper, actually, we were reading the newspapers there was the case of a whole village that was at risk of being expropriated because there was one man, who managed to establish a property title on the whole land that the village occupied. So the authorities gave him the title and he said, here's my title, so I own the village, you need to go away somewhere else. So those things happen. There's also a lot of conflicts between the informal occupants and the public authorities, of course, over the evictions, but also even during the interventions on land. When you do regularization or when you do resettlement operations, for instance, you have like a slum, if you want to improve the slum, you're going to improve it, but you have to move people, out of the slum. So while the developers are working on the slum, you're improving the roads, you're improving the street lighting, etc. But sometimes the people that you move are not the same people that the people who come occupy the land, right? So there are people who are, unhappy about it, rightly so. And it's also, this is very costly. All those things are very costly to the economy. It's a big source of political instability. I remember in the Ivory Coast, there was a book that the notaries had written. It was called Land, a Powder Keg for Côte d'Ivoire. So it's going to explode. Here's a picture that I took from a newspaper in Mali. It's a demonstration of land victims. So you can see many people are demonstrating in the streets. They are land victims. They are unhappy about the system. They feel they've been cheated, so they are demonstrating. So it's really, this shows you what the political instability is about. Okay, other ideas about why informality can be problematic. So informality can stand in the way of a productive urban development, right? One issue is that, cities expand. So when cities expand, you want to have like an urban planning function where you're going to accompany the expansion of the cities, plan what the activities are going to be, we have some type of, orderly layout of the city. But in fact, all those urban plans are seldom implemented. They're completely, in Africa, in most African countries, they're completely outpaced by the size, the pace of urban growth, which often happens in informal ways, right? In locations that were not supposed to be developed, in ways that were not supposed to be developed, they're informal. And it's very costly if you want to restructure those areas, later on. I think Soli Angel at New York University came up with a figure. I don't think it's an African figure, I think it's a Latin American figure, that is 8 times more costly to provide infrastructure in a slum after the slum has been erected than do it before people occupy the land. So because of that, cities may end up locked into some type of some city structure that is not sustainable and that is inefficient. So it reduces the productivity of cities, right? The cities does not function as well as it should because the land is not organized in an efficient way. Informal settlements can also be located in areas that are not, supposed to be developed in flood-prone areas, for instance. So this means that the population is going to be exposed to a lot of risks, but also that we cannot plan for disaster risk prevention. So it also has a cost to the city. An important topic here also is about the revenue generation potential of the land. So informality reduces that, that possibility. Taxing informal properties is difficult, although in some countries it's done. I know in Benin, they have these urban land registries that have been operating for about 30 years that actually function to some extent in generating public revenue. Also related to that, a very important idea in economics is that cities in infrastructure. Cities are really, do not have the financial means in order to fund the infrastructure. And the good way to fund the infrastructure to be to tax land, actually. Whenever you build an infrastructure, you improve the value of the land, so there's an increment in the land value. People who own the land, they benefit from the infrastructure, so they should be taxed in order to fund the infrastructure. Now, the issue is that if everything is informal and it's difficult to tax informal land use, then you don't have this opportunity. So there's a foregone, revenue opportunity here. Okay. I should say that all those issues that I've mentioned can be exacerbated. And to some extent, they're also caused by weak governance in land. So weak governance in land is a big problem. You can think about some, overlapping rights due to what we call legal pluralism. So that there are different types of property system that coexist for different reasons. So the customary tenure, the formal, the semi-formal. I mean, I don't have time to go into those details, but it can be problematic. The land registration systems are not, exhaustive. They don't cover the whole territory. Land administration has very poor capacity. It's not transparent. It can be very corrupt. And the tribunals are completely clogged, actually, with land disputes. I can't remember which countries, but usually people will tell you like 80% of the cases in the tribunal is about land issues, in some African countries. So it's really an important issue. So there have been policies to try to reduce informality and tenure insecurity. So first step, of course, is to improve the legal framework. So there has been a lot of progress here in many African countries. One thing that I really like is about the case of Benin, for instance. So most countries in Africa, they have this idea of eminent domain principle. The eminent domain principle states, often in the constitution, that whenever some land is not titled, it belongs to the state. So it makes people who occupy and use the land very insecure. In Benin, it's the opposite. They have the principle of presumption of ownership. If you use the land, you're presumed owner of that land, but we have to formalize you. You have to show the legitimacy, and there's a process of formalization. So it gives more tenure security to the people. So the whole land system in Benin is organized now around this idea, and they are actually working on setting up a full cadastre in Benin with a process that recognizes the presumption of ownership of the users. I think it's a very good step. So, of course, a policy is to modernize the land administration. You need to reduce the cost of formalization. When you want to formalize, there are many, many steps. At each step, there are many different stakeholders. Each stakeholder has some type of rent that it can derive from the process. So it's very long, it's very costly, and people, don't do it. So we want to reduce that, simplify the steps, and use the available, tools in order to make it cheaper, like computerization, etc. And you want to increase the coverage. And of course, the policies I mentioned before, regularization, resettlement, titling, those are very, standard approaches to informality. So those policies have had limited success because, governments have often low capacity, they have limited resources. Some of those interventions, they are like small scale, so it's difficult to replicate. It's also costly. And also when you formalize, there's a big issue, is that people revert to informality. Let's say we formalize a place, someone got a document, and then there's a subsequent transaction, and they don't go back to the registry because it's costly, so it becomes informal again. So the reversion to informality is really, really a big problem. There have been some successes about, planning for neighborhoods that are actually properly laid out through what is called sites and services. You just provide a location to the people, some basic infrastructure. The layout is kind of regular, and then people build incrementally over time. There's a paper actually by Guy Michaels and other in Tanzania that looks 30 years down the road what happened to sites and services, showing that people are actually better off with sites and services. And there's also some renewed thinking now about informality, is to try and prevent the formation of informal settlements, a little bit like in the sites and services philosophy, rather than try to address the issues after the informal settlements have been built. Another issue I want to talk about is the mega challenge of rapid urban expansion in sub-Saharan Africa. I kind of alluded to it. I think it's important to note that urban population is growing fast in sub-Saharan Africa. So this graph we did some time ago, so it's a bit outdated, I need to update, but it gives you the growth rates in terms of population of cities in the 4 Africa region, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa. So actually cities are growing much faster in West Africa. So the tension related to urban expansion is much higher in West Africa. So it's growing at impressive rates. So there's been a doubling of the population in 33 years when we look, with the benefit of hindsight, in Africa, and only 17 years in West Africa because of those higher growth rates. The population is now expected to double again by 2050. So there are a lot of figures around. The latest estimates that came from the Sahel Club, 2-3 months ago, was 700 million more people. I think they just relied on the standard UN data, but people have been saying 500, 600, 700, 800. It's a bit unclear, but it's a massive increase in the population, and this has implications for land, of course. So this I borrowed from a paper by Chu et al. It's just showing you the footprints of selection of African cities between 1990 and 2014. You can see, over 25 years how this increase. So they find an annual population increase of 4% and an annual increase in the built-up of 5%. So basically, there's almost a one-to-one relationship. Here's a graph. So we came up with a database of cities. I think Justin was discussing this morning about how we delineate cities. So we came up with a way of assembling the population data with different criteria, etc. We have 13,000 cities in the world with that. Others have done the same. And here for the African cities, so each dot is an African cities, and you have the 4 African regions here. It's showing the cross-sectional relationship between the logarithm of the population and the logarithm of the area, the footprint of the city. Basically, what it tells you is the elasticity of one. If you increase population by 10%, you increase city size by 10%. So having 700 million more people in African cities, a doubling of the population, means you have to basically double the land of the city. So that's a mega challenge. So this is the mega challenge. How are we going to provide decent land and housing to 1 billion people in just 2 or 3 decades? Given the present circumstances, we have informal expansion, weak governance, possible acceleration even of the rural-urban migration because of climate change, and complete lack of preparedness. I think I can say there's not much preparedness by the local authorities. So it may require thinking differently about formality and informality, as you were saying, Ivan, or also planning differently, prevent the formation of informal settlements. There's the idea of resorting to stripped-down versions of planning. This idea has been going around for a while. So Solly Angels and others, have said you need to plan for the arterial grid of roads. Just say we're going to build the infrastructure in the future. Make sure that people don't locate in those places, but let people just locate wherever they want, even if it's informal. At least you have a right structure for the city, an efficient structure of the city. And now the new idea is actually to go down. So this is the macro scale. You may also want to go down at the micro scale and ensure that the neighborhood are done properly. They are built properly. So for that, you want to have regular land subdivision. I was mentioning this paper by Guy Michaels and others about the benefits of site and services, where the layout is regular. So the idea is to ensure that you have regular layouts, and you can work actually with the customary authorities, the actual stakeholders on the ground, and actually to ensure to do that. Of course, you can embed that into some type of typing process to ensure people have property rights. But here we're really looking at the structure of the city. So important to ensure that at least you have good land subdivision. And there are examples actually of informal settlements that are properly laid out. What we want to understand is why Some informal settlements are not properly laid out, and some informal settlements are properly laid out, and it's an area for research that we're currently looking into with New York University and others. So, the research. Now I'm going to give you a glimpse into some of the research that I think, just talk about some of the papers that I wrote, not all of them, of course. Just give you a glimpse into those ideas. So some research questions. We want to understand the formation of informality. Why do we have informality in the first place? Not just the consequences. I think a lot of the research has focused, informality is bad. This creates such and such, impacts that are negative. We want to understand why you have informality. So why is there informality in cities? How do formal and informal land use coexist? I think there was a picture also by Justin this morning that talked about segregation. You can see a formal area and an informal area right next to one another. This is a picture from Brazil. You can see like a formal area, nice high rises, and then the complete informal area right next to it. So we want to understand what are the market mechanisms that make this happen. Why is it the case? Okay, you can think about history and inertia, etc. But there may also be some economic forces that explain this. So what explains the spatial patterns of informality within a city? Right? There are some regularities in terms of where informal settlements are located. Will informality disappear over time? So here's a graph. I don't know if you can see, but the x-axis is so each dot is a country. X-axis is the urbanization rate. That the percentage of people that live in cities. And the y-axis is the percentage of people living in slums. So this is from the World Development Indicator series, and this is just a cross-section, but you see that greater urbanization, countries become richer, and the percentage of people living in slums go down. But is it really the case? Is this what's going to happen in Africa? We just want to ask the question. So other questions. How do agents behave? How do households behave in informal land markets? So I'm going to show you that we have some research that look at, interestingly, how people move up the ladder of this continuum of tenuous situations, right? So how do they do that? How do buyers and sellers interact in situations where you are at risk, you have information asymmetry? Another question is, what is the social cost of informality, right? To what extent is the economy better off with and without informality? You can think about those issues with the help of, theory and theoretical models. You can try to assess also the efficiency of policies that aiming to reduce informality. Are they achieving their objectives or not? Maybe they're not. Can informality have benefits? Okay, maybe it's more of a second-best perspective. As Ivan was saying, access to the city is very important. It gives people an opportunity to participate in the city, have access to the labor market, close to jobs, etc. The idea of densification. I remember discussing with the city of Cape Town staff, telling me when they're thinking about the backyarding phenomenon, for instance, that, it's like semi-formal. So backyarding is you have subsidized, housing. There's a big program that's in South Africa. People are given a little garden, and they use the garden in order to erect some informal structures there. It's kind of illegal, but on the other hand, it helps with the densification of the city. It gives people access to jobs. We can think about those issues. So there may be also some benefits to informality. So, informality in equilibrium. So I like to think about cities as a system, right? Different aspects of the system interact with one another. So economists, they like to model cities as a system. So those models, they can have a representation of space. It can be just, a simple line. It can be 2 dimensions. You can make maps, 3 dimensions with height. So we like to develop those models. And the idea is that there are interactions between the formal and informal markets. So what are those interactions? So here's a first paper that I worked on with Jan Bruckner. It's our squatting model. We try to understand the interaction between formal and informal. So here in that model, you have squatters. People may decide actually to squat the land. They may decide to purchase the land or may decide to squat the land. When they squat the land, they do not pay the land price, but they pay some type of defensive expenditure to a squatter organizer, if you want, in order to be able to stay on the plot. And in that model, there's limited land supply it can be like geographic reasons, like a city like Mumbai, for instance, cannot extend too much. Or it can be also, the process of making land available for housing is not very elastic, does not function well. So when you have limited supply, the fact that you have people who do not pay for the land that they occupy, but only pay a different expenditure, will make them use more land than they would otherwise do if they were paying for the actual price of the land. This kind of squeezes the other people on the formal sector, right? And because of the law of supply and demand, you have limited supply. With demand, it makes high prices. So basically, this gives rise to this graph where you have coexistence in the same system, in the same city, with people squatting on the land and who are not paying rent, and people living in formal land segments with high land prices and high rises. So that was the first model. First thinking, let's think about informality as a part of the system. It's not something in isolation. It's part of the system, and there's an equilibrium mechanism between formal and informal. The two interact with one another. It's important to understand that. So that was like one paper. Okay, I don't know if I go into those details, but since some of you are studying economics, this equilibrium is not optimal. There's some type of market failure associated with that. We can show actually that you can have some type of taxation and redistribution in the model in order to improve the situation of everyone. So basically, if you formalize people, everyone is going to be better off. People in the formal area, they're going to be less squeezed, so the prices will go down for them. And people in the informal area, they will also be better off. But this requires redistribution. So another idea of informality in equilibrium, in this paper, that's a working paper. We never took the time to publish it, but this mechanism has been replicated in other models since then. We look at the spatial patterns of informality from a theory perspective. So people who are interested in urban economics, we have this standard model where people compete for land. They want to have accessibility, so when they're closer to a city center, they will pay a greater price. When they're further away, they will be further away from the jobs, but they will pay a lower price for the land. That's the standard monocentric model, if you want, in a nutshell. So we take that model and we add some tenure and security in there. So basically, when you buy a land, you also buy a property right. So you purchase from the land administration a property right along the continuum of tenure situations. So if you pay very little, you can get some type of semi-formal document with some level of tenure security, but not complete. If you pay more, you're going to get a fully fledged property rights. And in that model, we show that if you look how far away you are from the CBD, you have the formal property rights close to the city center, and then the rest of the continuum with the completely informal property rights further away from the city center. This is what we obtain in this model. Each city is specific. It's not the case everywhere, but in that model we have that. And this actually works well with data from Bamako, Mali, that I'm not going to show here because I have a presentation during the conference when I'm going to show that. But anyway, just to give you some glimpse into this type of models. Okay, another paper, we looked at the dynamics of informality. This is the question that I asked. Is informality going to persist over time, or is it going to disappear when countries and cities are going to get richer over time with development? So here we have also another land use model, but this time it's a dynamic model, and there are some shocks to the model. So the idea is you have a rural area and people migrate to the city, and when they migrate to the city, they earn a wage, and the more people migrate to the city, you have agglomeration effects. Justin was talking about the agglomeration effects in the earlier session. When the agglomeration effects kick in, people are richer. They can actually also pay formalization costs, so they formalize. So there's this whole dynamics of people moving to the city. Maybe they start informally, and then they will become formal. But then there are shocks. People may be evicted during the time where they are occupying the land informally. Then they will leave the city and go back to the rural area. So this is the idea of the model. And here I'm showing you the urbanization rate as the y-axis is the percentage of the population in the city, and I'm showing you the formal residents and the informal residents over time. So it's a discrete model. We have several periods. So the first time you have like a city urbanization rate. I mean, it's a stylized model, right? So people who come to the city, they're all formal. Then you have more people coming in the third period. It's all formal. And then in the fourth period, someone comes in, but is informal and gets evicted. And then in the fifth period, another person comes back, does not get evicted, etc. And then in the end, the whole the whole system becomes urbanized at 80% and everyone is formal. So this worked well under agglomeration effects that were strong, right? That's one scenario. It's the disappearance of informality under strong agglomeration effects. So we can be optimistic and say, okay, if the economy works well, maybe informality will disappear over time. But maybe we can say another story also. So here we have two parameters of the model. One is the formalization cost, and the other is the probability of eviction. So the formalization cost depends on, let's say, the efficiency of the land administration. It's very high in many places, so people don't formalize because it's too costly. And probability of eviction can be also a policy parameter, the tolerance for informality. And we run the same simulation, right? But since there are some, it's a stochastic model, can I put it? There are probabilities of being evicted every time. The trajectories can, differ whenever we draw those probabilities. So we do it like 100,000 times for each values of the two parameters. And this shows you what we have in what the economists call the steady states in the long run. So basically what you see here is when formalization cost is sufficiently low, if we are able to formalize, cheaply, whatever the probability of eviction, you get a fully formal economy in the end. But when formalization cost is high, you will end up with informal housing in your cities, even in the long term. And this is the case where you don't have strong agglomeration effects also. So informality can persist over time. I'm not going to talk about the optimum and suboptimum of those equilibria, but we also compare what the market leads. And we showed that there's some type of market failure in the sense that the planner would actually have an optimal city structure with informal housing. So here in this model, under this condition and these parameters, it is optimal to have informal housing in the city because people have access to the city, they can work, they contribute to the agglomeration effect, etc. So we argue against actually eradicating informality in that sense. So this is like super theoretical stuff, but we also did some, field work, more with surveys. So here's a book that we wrote about land delivery systems. The idea of land delivery systems is you take a plot and you look at the history of the plot. So here we look at the peri-urban area of Bamako, and we have the customary owners. They kind of extract themselves from the customary system because they sell the land. So the institution said you do not sell land, but they sell the land. And we look at what happens to the plots in terms of the transformation of its use and the transformation of its tenure. So here's a nice picture. This is really the far periphery of Bamako. It's where the rural area meets the city. And you can see there are different types of developments. There's some formal stuff. There's the old village mosque you can see behind. There's a building that is being built. There's a road here that is empty, but there was a shop already that was operating. So it's showing you the transformation of the city, right, with urban expansion. So anyway, I'm just showing you this to talk quickly about what we found out. So we have a survey. It's an interesting survey because it's not a survey of people, it's a survey of plots. So in 2012, we selected randomly many plots, like 1,300 in the city. And we go to those plots and we triangulate information and try to find out, those are empty plots. Like when they were transacted, who sold them, who purchased them, what the price was, do they have infrastructure, what is the tenure status when they sold it, what is the tenure status now. And we look retrospectively over a period of 3 years. So here I have shown the continuum of tenure rights with no documents, some administrative documents, the use rights, the fully fledged ownership title in 2009 and in 2012. And this is a matrix that shows you the change. So what is really interesting is you can see there's some evolution. So people move up the ladder, of the continuum of property rights. So it's a dynamic system. People are trying to go towards the fully fledged property rights, towards the title. In many cases, they stop before. It's too costly, they don't have time, it's too complex. So they stop before, but there's a process. There's a dynamic process, and it's really interesting to understand that. Okay, another piece of research here, I was mentioning we want to understand how people behave in informal markets, right? So the issue is that informal markets are risky. You have tenure insecurity on those plots. You can have like multiple sales. Someone sells you the plot that that person does not own. So you need to trust, when you're a buyer, you need to trust the person you purchase the plots from. And we've done this research in Mali because in Mali there's a very strong social institution that dates back to the 13th century. called cousinage. I don't know who's familiar with joking relationships and cousinage. Okay, no one. Anyway, in Mali, there's this idea that everyone from a particular ethnic group has a relation with the other ethnic groups. And they're like cousins, they're like part of the same family. Right? If you're part of one group, there's another group that you're cousin to. And you're supposed to help one another and to trust one another. So we have this complex theoretical model where we have those ethnic relationships in an informal and formal land market. But here I just want to talk about the empirical part, of that paper. So in order to understand how this functions, we had a little experiment where we went to many different places in the city and we asked people to respond to a little questionnaire. There were some vignettes and they were telling, okay, you are Mr. Diarra, you have Mr. Cissé, who wants to sell a plot, and these are the characteristics of the plot, here's the location, do you trust Mr. Cissé? This is how we ask those things. We know that Diarra is a farmer, because it's an ethnic name of a farmer. We know that Cissé is a marabout, so he's more like a religious person. So is there like an coded ethnic relationships between the farmers and between the marabout? So we have a lot of variations in this, and then we look at how people respond in terms of trusting or not trusting to buy the land. And this is what we get. So we ask the people, do you trust or not buying from that person? And we compare here if that person you're related to that person in the cousinage relationship or you're not related to that person. If it's a formal plot, there's no reduction in trust because it's formal plot, you have full tenure security. However, if it's an informal plot, you feel that when you buy from a cousin, the perception of the risk is lower. So you have trust in those people. So what I want to show you here is that trust is very important in those informal markets, and people will match, the buyers and the seller will match with one another based on the trust. So that's basically the idea of the papers. But let me continue, because I see time is running. Backyarding. So backyarding in South Africa. So it's a mix of formal and informal land use, as I was saying. So I think we can view backyarding of some type of efficient market response, if it's informal, to oversupply of backyard space. Maybe people who were given the subsidized housing in Africa did not need a backyard. If they were to pay the land price of the market, they would have consumed less space for the garden. So they kind of react by renting out the garden space, and they're better off by renting out the garden space, and there's a market for that. So what we did is that we had satellite imagery information in all the plots in Cape Town and the number of backyards and where they are located. So we have a theory model where our theory predicts that you will have more backyarding when the land rent is high, right? And our empirical work shows that backyarding is actually frequent in places that have greater job accessibility. So it's a labor market story that we're having. There's greater job accessibility in the location, land rent is higher, and people do more backyarding. So we understand the dynamics of backyarding. I know there's been a Cape Town backyarding survey, which is super interesting. There was also a conclusion that there were links between the owners and the renters. We can look into more detail into those types of surveys, but it's really good that the city of Cape Town has had this initiative. So let me conclude here, just a few remarks. So essentially, it was just a glimpse in some of the research. There are plenty of other things that could be talked about. Just wanted to, give you some idea, some flavor of the type of things that we do at the research department of the World Bank. So maybe one lesson is that informality should not be thought of in isolation. Like, oh, here I have informal location, I'm going to, upgrade it, etc. I think there are interactions between formal and informal and market segments. So people make choices, right? They are constrained choices because they are constrained by their income, but they make choices. I think it's important to have analyses that are systemic, understand how the system functions, and also dynamic. I showed you that people try to move up the ladder of the continuum of property rights. And I think it's also important to understand the sources of informality. If we want to address them, or if we want to accompany them, or if we want to improve them, why are people making those choices. So I showed you, for instance, for backyarding, they're making those choices because it gets them close to jobs, it gives them access to the city, so maybe it's a good thing. Maybe the question is, how do we provide infrastructure to those people? How do we ensure that they pay the fair rate for the water and the electricity, they have the connections, the meters, etc. Those are like very operational stuff. Okay, other point is land issues are complex. Maybe I think there's a need to expand the scope of studies of informality, right? I've shown you like very complex situation. There are plenty of research that can be done. I think it's important to understand and account for the context that is legal, okay? Like a property right is a legal definition. Institutionals, like customary tenure is an institution, for instance. Social, anthropological. I mentioned those ethnic relationships between groups in Mali. So many topics remain to be studied. For instance, I think there's the issue of speculative land holdings. As cities are growing, there's a lot of discussion of people, a rush for people to buy plots at the periphery of African cities, and then they sit on it because they know that the land value is going to increase and they're going to sell it to someone else, etc. Is this problematic? Is this some type of predatory behavior? What should be done about it? How can we measure it? If people sit on the plot, they don't construct it, is it problematic in some of the structure of the city, having some, leapfrogging of space, cities not being built correctly? I think there should be some research on that. I think it's very important. One can think also about the rents extracted from informality. The idea is that people benefit from informality, not the informal users, but all the stakeholders, actually. For instance, in an informal settlement in South Africa, you will have some type of, I forgot the name of the community organizers in South Africa, but they will make money out of it. They pretend that they are providing protection, but in fact, they may be racketeering, people, those type of things. It's important to understand. But it's not just this example. It can be also people in the land administration. When you have this continuum of property rights and you move from, let's say, a semi-formal to a formal type, there will be someone in an office that just needs to put a stamp on the paper. And then your right becomes more secure and the value of the land increases. So maybe that person is going to ask for a bribe. If you increase by 30% the value of your land and that person just needs to put his stamp on the paper, then this person has a lot of power on you. And I could tell you a lot of story of corruption. I'm not going to do it, but studying those processes for a long time, I can tell you there's a lot of that. So and also the idea is there's a political economy issue here. We have a system that has some problems that we want to improve, but whenever you want to do a reform, there are people who oppose it. So the idea is that people who would benefit from the reform, they don't have the means to change things. But people who would lose from the reform, they have the means to prevent it from happening. So the whole research on the political economy of reforms that are needed in the land sector is actually important. It's important to map out all the different stakeholders. It can be the surveyors, the notaries, the land administration, the village chiefs, different ministries. There are so many stakeholders involved in the system. One has to understand who has interest to do what. There's also the idea that you want to reform a land administration, but if the land administration doesn't want to be reformed, then what do you do? For instance, if the registries are not computerized, because there are some people who don't want other people to see how many assets they own, where those assets are located, the value of those assets, then that will prevent people from modernizing the system. So the political economy question is a big important issue. So I think the policies need to take into account the different facets of this complexity that I tried to show you today. You need to understand what is the context, what is the problem. Is there a problem actually, or do we want to accept some level of informality? What type of informality? What is the objective of the policy? In order to define the objective of the policy, you have to understand what's going on the ground. And what's going on the ground is quite complex, right? And then in order to design an intervention, you have to think about what you're going to do exactly, so you have to understand the complexity. In order to assess the policy, you also have to think about what you want to look at, whether it's a micro effect, macro effects. It's a system. So whatever you do is going to affect the rest of the system. If you do land intervention and price increase, then people may make different location choices. You may have gentrification of the area. So some poor people may lose access to those locations where they have access to jobs, those type of things. So it's really complex. So one has to think about this complexity in a systematic way. As I was saying, I think it's very important. It's not just, we have a slum here, we're going to formalize it, and it's nice. It's not the same people. People have relocated. There are long-term effects. People have to understand this complexity. And most importantly, there's a need for data. So I was mentioning the Cape Town survey on backyarding. I think it's really a great initiative. I remember that the city of Cape Town was talking about, at one point, about integrating informality into the data system, so just to have knowledge of things that I think is very important. Cadastres also, it's not just about registering the fully fledged property rights. It's about recording what happens on the ground, who has some claim, are there like some rights, some secondary rights. So we're working on those more flexible cadastres that are inclusive of the reality of the country. I think it's a good approach to have. So basically, I think this is what I wanted to tell you today. It's just a glimpse into some of the land concepts, some of the land issues, some of the questions that we want to ask, and some of the research that can shed a little bit of light on that. So I didn't go very deep into the research. There are plenty of more things I could have talked about, but it's a short presentation. And here just have, reference list of some of the stuff that I did and others did. Of course, there are many other stuff from also other researchers, but I'm going to stop here. I see we just have 3 minutes left. There may be 1 or 2 questions that we could take. Yes. Yes. Can you make sure you speak loudly? I have a big hearing impaired.
Eni Iliazi, PhD student at Wharton UPenn. You touched briefly on this, but I still wanted to ask you, why do you think, given the evidence we have on titling papers like Field or Galliani, why don't we see larger effects on access to credit, like using titles as collateral?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So maybe I'll answer the question and then So access to credit, has been discussed a lot because Hernando de Soto, whom Bill Clinton once called the most important economist in the USA or the whole world, I can't remember, came up with the idea that with formalization, you're going to unlock capital. I don't know how many billions of dollars and solve all the problems of the world. So there's been a lot of focus on, okay, let's formalize, people will have access to credit, they're going to invest, and there's going to be positive impacts that will lead to growth and development. So the reality is that first, do people want to mortgage their homes? We're talking about residential locations. I'm not going to mortgage my home just to start a business. The other reality is that in order to have access to credit, you need a financial institution that wants to lend to you. And usually we're talking about poor people. So maybe you want microfinance more than finance in order to fund some small project. Maybe microfinance does not need mortgaging of your house. So there are those type of issues. What is the enabling context for people to, what is the demand for credit? And what is the enabling context that allows people to have credit? I think that's 2 of the main obstacles. So this is why I was saying that providing title is not a silver bullet that will give people access to credit. There's a paper, the big critique of the De Soto. I forgot the author, but I can find out and send it to you. There's a guy who lists all those arguments, and it's been discussed for 20 years, 30 years. So yeah, it's a good question. Yes.
Yes, hello, thank you. I'm Jack Allender. I work at JPL Africa. So you mentioned that sometimes informality gets in the way of sort of productive land use strategies and policies. And you also mentioned that providing tenure is another way of ensuring more productive use of land.
Yes.
To me, it seems that these might be in tension sometimes, that if you provide title to someone who's living in a place that, say, could be better served being a train station or a sewer or something, that you might find a tension between these things. So how do we deal with that? Is that just a policy issue? Yes. Is that just something we need to figure out?
Yes. So I think it's all about trade-offs. What is it that you want to promote? So if you give someone tenure, sure, they will invest, but what investment will that be? If it will be like, small business, maybe that, good for that person, it contributes a little bit more to the economy and the surplus. But if in that location you could have, as you mentioned, a very important infrastructure that is very central for the city with hundreds of thousands of people who will commute and have access to jobs, maybe the impact will be greater than that. So you need to have maybe ex-ante assessment of what you want to do with the land and try to understand the trade-off and what is best. And with any interventions, there are winners and losers, so you always want to make sure that the losers are compensated, so they are at least as well off as they were before the intervention. Otherwise, you should not do the interventions like that. There's a no harm principle in those interventions. So this is why you need economists, actually, to look at those issues, people who can think properly and thinking about the trade-offs and the impacts and do some simulation maybe. So we have developed some tools, and there will be a demonstration during the conference on two land use and transport simulation tools for the city of Cape Town that looks at what policies you want to do and is going to affect the city as a whole in terms of a system. So you can show job relocation, employment, those type of things. I mean, it's difficult to model, but at least we have some kind of tools to help us support the decisions. And you can think about land market decision. We're using those models also to look at land market issues.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very inspiring presentation. I am Zagga from Ethiopia. I work in the Policy Studies Institute.
So you work for?
Policy Studies Institute in Ethiopia.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a very inspiring presentation. Yeah, I want to add some points about the experience of Ethiopia. We tried to formalize 2 times in the last 30 years through land adjustment. We try to make this land adjustment and try to formalize it. But the problem is it starts to again rise due to corruption, due to instability, and particularly there was escalating informal settlement during election periods. And now the government tries to develop a draft law that aims to demolish the land, and you will be allowed again to buy with the formal land price again. Once it demolishes, you will be allowed to buy it with the equivalence to the formal land price. And my point here is I need to learn more. If you tell us any country or any town or city that is effective enough in converting these informal settlements towards more formalization and more developed for. Thank you very much.
Okay. So maybe in Ethiopia, there are 2 researchers in the research department of the World Bank, Daniel Ali, who's Ethiopian, and Klaus Deininger. They have written several papers on the land reform in Ethiopia, actually. So I can refer you to those papers. They look at the impact of land reform in Ethiopia. They probably talk also about all the hurdles, etc. They have a series of papers, actually, on Ethiopia. And I think they've also written papers on Rwanda. And Rwanda is an interesting case where there's big, formalization at a low cost, and it's covered the whole country, etc. So people look at that. If you're interested into the operational side of the Rwandan experience, we have one of our land experts actually was involved in the Rwandan land project. I think he was even overseeing the whole project, so I could put you into contact with him, and you can talk to him. He has a lot of operational lessons about how they manage to do things. You had a question?
Thank you. My name is Yoli Swatiwe from Stellenbosch University. So I basically wanted to find out your opinion around land invasions. So there's a property or there's a land that is currently owned by a state-owned enterprise in South Africa. In Bellville, but the thing is the land is now occupied illegally by people who have put in their squatter camps and all of that, and it's behind a taxi rank bus terminus, and people have been complaining that they're being robbed. There's a safety concern around that. And the city of Cape Town, when I hear, is that they've told the company that they need to remove those people because it's a safety and security concern. So it seems like it's more of a communication and not a strict rule from the city of Cape Town to basically ask the state-owned company to remove those people. what is your opinion, how can municipalities take those implications or those costs towards those private companies or state-owned companies to also feel the costs or the implications of those negative outcomes from those land invasions?
So I don't have a opinion on policies. I think it's an internal process of deciding the policies. I think it's just I mentioned that what is important is a no harm principle to ensure that no one loses actually from any intervention. That people who would relocate to some place are sufficiently compensated. That's a principle for all the World Bank projects. We have some safeguards, operational safeguards for all our projects that implement those type of principles. I mean, that's all I can tell you. I don't know the specific
So
context.
there's no paper around that you know.
Yeah. So you may want to talk to a City of Cape Town people during the conference. Okay. So Juliana, can we have one last and then we stop, or? I can't hear you very well.
I come from Nelson Mandela, but
Yes, can you give him the mic?
in following up question, I'm Tampa Masiba. I come from Free State Bloemfontein, but I'm studying with Nelson Mandela Human Settlement Development. I've got a question about land invasion, especially in South Africa, based off our historical events. There was an incident that happened in Bloemfontein last year, where there was a sense of informality around the suburbs on the west of Bloemfontein. People were removed. But what I've studied is that when informal settlement is happening amongst the people of color, then you can form informality, people weren't removed. But if you go to the west of Bloemfontein, there was an issue about Lorry Park where people were removed. So what I'm trying to understand is, what is your opinion about the racial issues, especially when it comes to informality in South Africa, especially informal settlement, about land invasion, where certain people are more privileged and they are not allowed, like there is an issue about race when it comes to informality. Certain people are allowed to experience informality and others is the issue of the land market, the value. What is your own opinion about that?
So I don't have an opinion, but what I was saying is that we need to understand, when you look at land issues, the context of the country, the context of the past of South Africa, the objective of redressing imbalances. I think all those things should be taken into account. I mean, I don't know the specific context and I don't have an opinion, just, an approach is whatever intervention you have in the system, you need to understand the context. And I mean, those are political issues also, right? So those are also political questions. I'm just an economist, I'm just, telling you about how to think about land markets and what to do. So I'm not the person to answer this question, but I understand the sensitivity of the issues. I mean, what can I tell you?